guys, we're here at MDC Music Studios here in Toronto. We've got our Marshall from our friends over at Backline Plus, which is the Toronto area's go-to providers for backline. I've got Matt Brown here on his beautiful Les Paul. Nice to see you, Matt.
Hey, how are you?
We're going to demo this amp for you guys today. So let's talk about the setup that we have here. I see you got your Les Paul there.
Yeah, so nothing fancy, just going, old gray cable straight into the head because, you just want to hear what the amp sounds like. Anybody can put a pedal in front of something and color it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we've got the head going straight into the cabs, mic'd up with a 57 and a 421.
Yep.
We're going into the board here at MDC Music Studios. And tell me about the history of this amp. What do we have here and why is it special?
I mean, if you want to keep it real simple, it's basically a kind of almost like a copy of an old Bassman that Leo Fender made in the late 50s. But at the time in England, finding any kind of Fender amplifier, let alone one that's going to work on their voltages over there, was few and far between.
Right, right. So, and was it the Fender Bassman that was originally made to play?
Yeah, the Fender Bassman was originally, obviously, hence its name, was supposed to be a bass amplifier, and then guitar players get a hold of it, and they thought, well, this sounds a hell of a lot better with a guitar going through it than an old precision bass. So, Jim Marshall, obviously, got a hold of one of those, and then he's like, well, let's see if I can do something with this. So basically, it's more or less the same layout. I mean, most of the Marshalls from that day were the same layout, minus a couple of changes in resistor values and stuff like that as it went on to, gradually create more gain and stuff like that. But with, obviously, they were using European stuff as opposed to like the Mallory caps and all that stuff that they had over in the United States.
And they started calling these Plexis at a certain time. Where did that come from?
It started early on, and that's just because of this panel here was a sheet of plexiglass that was just, tinted and screen printed on for the front. And those stayed with those amplifiers till about somewhere in 1969 when they switched over to a metal panel. And then therefore it was always metal.
Right, right. Still maintaining the same look and everything, but then that panel gets switched over to metal, but we still hold it.
And obviously filtering and stuff like that too. The amps became a little bit tighter, a little more aggressive and stuff like that as the music scene kind of became as such as well, right?
Nowadays, these amps are kind of revered as the part of the holy trinity of guitar amps, right?
Yeah, people love them. There's a reason people love them because they have a wonderful, warm sound. Especially the old ones are very thick because they weren't really necessarily set up for like lead, I guess, as we know today, where there's like a lot of treble and stuff like that. They were just very warm. There was no big bright cap value. I mean, this one has one because that's how the reissues come. But lovely sound. I mean, who's who of anybody has played these dang things? Obviously, Clapton, probably one of the most famous people, and Angus Young. I think his was maybe a JTM 50, but he used these extensively. And I feel like even still live in an ISO box under the stage, he's got a speaker away from everything else, and a couple of these heads just powering them.
Right on. I mean, the wall of Marshall amps on a rock and roll stage is kind of iconic symbolism.
Oh God,
what people expect to see.
Yeah, even if you don't know anything about like music or amplifiers and stuff, you could pick one of these out of a thing because they're so iconic. Absolutely. So Marshalls among Fender amps and Vox amps are kind of the three big historical amp companies. Marshall's become a little bit renowned for a particular sound that maybe those other two amps aren't quite achieving. Does this have to do with the gain that they're able to pull out of the amps? The circuit in general. I mean, obviously Fenders have changed many, many times over the years, depending on what era of the circuit you're looking at. Obviously, the Tweed one is probably the most closest in terms of what this is.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure the mixer resistor values are a bit different, but obviously the transformers, there's a lot of parts at play that would separate the two. You could say, yeah, they're basically the same thing. They're not, really. I mean, the transformers are completely different. You're running it through a 412 as opposed to, you got 410s in a basement and stuff like that. Vox is more of your, like, chimey, like, or very throaty, like a Brian May, that just, in your mind, you think infinite sustain.
Yeah.
And obviously the Beatles early on before they switched over to, like, the Silverface Fenders and stuff like that.
When I think of Vox, I think of three guys, the Edge, Brian May, and then like early Beatles.
Right, the Edge. Yeah. How did I forget?
I don't think he's going straight into the amp like we are today.
No, probably not, no.
Yeah, he's got a bit of an effects chain.
Yeah.
Well, let's turn on the amp and let's hear what it sounds like. Tell us about how you're set up, what pickups you're using, and what the potentiometers are set to.
Pickups, I believe these are just the custom buckers that came with the guitar. I don't have it set particularly loud because the bright cap, it's overdriven almost already. And like we're barely at about 2, and it's it's going to sound like it's a hell of a lot louder than that. But I'll give her a go.
Sounds good. All right, how about you show us how this amp sounds with that Les Paul?
Sure, yeah, I can do that.
Hell yeah, man. You're filling the room with that amp on 2.
Yeah.
It's one of the loudest amps I think I've ever had the pleasure of sitting next to.
Oh, really, eh?
I think so. So we got a 4x12 cabinet down here, right? Yeah, so we got 2 of the cabs, or the 2 of the cones mic'd up.
Yep.
And yeah, we're getting some serious volume out of that.
Yeah, especially with that bright cap in there like I was talking about. Boy, is that ever aggressive on 2.
Yeah, so the originals didn't have this bright cap.
Typically wouldn't, no. Because a lot of them back then were just bass, as they call it, bass spec. So either guitar or lead. Typically, if it was a lead model, you might throw like a very tiny bright cap on the high treble channel.
Right, okay.
But in terms of like all the, I don't want to get super technical, all the coupling stuff and the post-phase inverter, but like it was pretty much the same amp to amp, and really lead to bass wasn't much of a difference until about 1968.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And tell me about, we're talking about Fender, we're talking about Vox and Marshall. Is there any reason why Marshall is making stack amps instead of the combo amps more famously manufactured by Fender?
I think a lot of that came down to Townsend, Pete Townsend of The Who.
Yeah, okay.
He wanted something, he wanted to be, obviously we all know him as a guy who wants to be really, really loud. And he's like, how could I need a certain amount of speakers? So initially they had built a cabinet that was 8/12, and obviously that was a killer on the roadies and whoever was moving the equipment around. So he's like, what if we just slice it in half in the middle? So that begat the 2 4/12 cabinets.
Right, okay,
which we still use to these days, or some people still do anyway.
And we call these days a half stack.
Yeah.
Right, because it's the 4 12-inch speakers rather than the original 8.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's
I mean,
cool.
the 8 probably didn't last very long once they figured out how much of a pain in the ass it was to lug that around.
I can only imagine. But
Even just a half stack, even just a half stack's, it's a lot of work to move them around anyways.
It's a lot of work for sure. One time I saw a guy playing at an open mic, and he came up to play one song, and he brought a Marshall stack on stage. We're all
The man's a hero.
Yeah, it's like took him longer to set up than it did for him to play, but
Worth
but
it.
it certainly sounded really good and really loud for sure. So we got the cab and the head sort of format emerges from the need to be louder, the need to really fill up a stage, and then we're cutting the head out of the amp in order to make it easier to transport.
Yeah, and I'm sure it also has a lot to, well, not a lot, but somewhat to do with the fact that you have all these fragile pieces of glass, the tubes in the back of them in a combo amp, and you get the speakers and they're rattling the thing, and you can the possibility of anything going microphonic or breaking on it increases a hell of a lot more.
Yeah,
and this,
totally.
at least you're sitting on top. I mean, you look at the photos or even videos of the guys back in the old days, and they have typically a piece of foam between the head and the cabinet itself.
Just to keep it from getting damaged.
Just to cut down on vibrations.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the history of the amp. We've started a little bit with the manufacturing and Jim Marshall.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the guitar heroes who start to use this amp in the 60s. So we mentioned Pete Townsend, of course. Are there any other guys that really make this amp famous?
I mean, the one name that always comes to my mind is Clapton, because I mean he started, not necessarily, he did have the head version, but the combo version, which became colloquially known as the Blues Breaker, was the one that he was using a lot, especially in the early days when he was with John Mayall and the Blues Breakers, which is basically this in a combo format that might have had a trem circuit in it.
Yeah, and there's like a lot of pedals that are being made these days to emulate that sound,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
The Marshall in a box sort of thing.
Oh, yeah.
Well, this is the original box.
Yes, this is indeed.
But not quite as portable. So Clapton joins the Blues Breakers. Are they getting their name from the band from this amp, or is it the other way around?
No. The amp was just known after the fact, like as the Blues Breaker model, because they all saw the photo of him, and he's like, "Oh, that's Eric Clapton from Cream, and he's playing that amp."
That's the Blues Breaker
Yeah.
amp. Cool.
Yeah, I think the model was the 1962 in their catalog.
Yeah. All right. Well, in '69, a certain band forms, and they start releasing some music. They get pretty big throughout the '70s. I think you know who I'm hinting about.
Something with Robert Plant,
So
probably.
Robert Plant and another guy named
Yeah.
Jim, I think, right?
Yeah.
So he's a big Marshall guy too, right?
He is. He wasn't necessarily using this model, but he was using typically the bigger, the 100-watt ones.
Yeah,
And then
right.
he eventually modified some of those to be even, I think, 200 to give him even more clean headroom.
And is he using the eight speaker stack?
He was definitely using a full stack.
Right.
Yeah.
And for the kids at home, we're talking about Jimmy Page, by the way. We haven't said him by name yet.
James Patrick Page, yeah.
Patrick,
Yeah.
didn't know that. And what about Jimi Hendrix is using?
Hendrix, obviously another, when you think of the guys that used Marshall, that'd be probably number 2, if not number 1, depends on who you ask.
Yeah, totally.
Because he was an early adopter of those because he wanted to be loud like everybody else because that was important back then. They had crappy PA systems, and if you wanted to be heard, you had to bring things like these. I mean, this probably would have been unacceptably quiet on a stage back then.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I one of my favorite Jimi Hendrix videos or live performances is him live at Maui.
Oh, yeah.
And I can only imagine what it was like to get a huge Marshall stack on a plane out to Maui.
Yeah, the logistics of shipping that thing out there, right?
Yeah, but I hope it was worth it because he's definitely a legend.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. So going into the 70s and into the 80s, do any other guys start showing up that are using Marshalls? I know we were talking about the Police and Andy Summers.
Andy Summers did, I think he had like a late 70s Mark II JMP with the rocker switches on it.
Yeah, that's cool.
A little more aggressive than this thing. Well, maybe not. The bright cap on this is pretty aggressive, but obviously late 70s can't go without talking about Eddie Van Halen,
of course.
who had a 68 that he bought off of, I think it was the Rose Palace. There was a banquet hall that was there in Los Angeles, and he had saved up enough money to buy it off them, and it was a 68, which now obviously everybody connects it when you think 1968 Marshall, like, oh yeah, you must be an Eddie fanatic, and it's like, well, maybe necessary, but I mean, obviously Jeff Beck had also used them back in the 60s.
Right.
So did ZZ Top. So did like a lot of people.
Right.
But that amp synonymous with Eddie, I'd say.
There's almost an entire industry built around not only replicating the original Marshall amps from the 60s, but replicating the sounds of the players that were using them.
Absolutely, yeah.
Totally. Yeah, there's so many pedals and amps and signal chains that people are
absolutely.
Experimenting with to get this sound. I'm just thinking of Hendrix. The iconic signal chain is going through a Strat into a wah into a fuzz face, and then maybe into Univibe, and then right into the Marshall. And I'm thinking of guys like Andy Summers. Signal chain is going out of the Telecaster Strat that he's playing into a Boss Chorus or that flanger.
Yeah, the Electric Mistress,
Electric Mistress for sure. And then maybe like a Roland Space Echo.
Yeah.
But it all ends here. It all ends with the Marshall at the end of the signal chain.
God, yeah.
That's cool. All right. So we're talking a lot about the history of the amp and its volume. It's a huge sounding amp. And a lot of the players that we're talking about really like to push them into distortion.
Absolutely, yeah.
So is there a way that we can use this amp at a lower volume but still get that classic Marshall sound?
Yeah, a lot of people nowadays would probably use something like an air brake, which Dr. Z made. I think it was a Ken Fisher design, and like anything that is basically just like a big resistor that just kind of soaks up some of that power. You're not going to quite get the same sound, but it'll be close enough that no one's really going to notice. Or there's even things like the the Universal Audio, the aux box. That can also be used as an attenuator, and obviously you can just record straight into it with one of these.
I've even seen some guys down in Nashville in particular that just run a volume pedal on the front end of the amp of their guitar.
Yeah.
Is that kind of achieving the same sort of effect, or not as
I
much?
think that's just more for controlling the overall level of grit that you got going in there.
Right, and so some amps, like I know Vox makes a lot of amps with master volumes, but this is something that Marshall never really does. Is this to maintain the simplicity of the circuit or something else?
Well, back then master volume was like a foreign concept. They didn't do that. They were just like, well, if you want it to be louder, you make it louder. You're not going to have more gain and turn it down overall. That was more of a thing until like probably the late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah.
It's like the late JMPs or the early JCM 800s, which had like a preamp gain and then a post or master volume.
Yeah. So another feature that Marshall is really well known for is having 4 inputs on their amps. Some Fenders have 2, some Voxes have 2, but Marshall's got 4. Tell me about why they have this and what they do.
So essentially, each one of these vertically side by each, this is for one channel, this is for the other. We have a high treble, which is your more aggressive one. It's got like a little bit more punch and just overdrive and that kind of wonderful stuff. And then this side is a little bit more tame. Some people like that. I know Clapton used to plug into that and then just roll that up a little bit because there's a little bit of bleed that way. But most people, if they want to blend the two channels, would use a jumper cable like we have right here.
Oh, cool. Tell me about that.
So you're taking, it's a much longer cable, so we have it draped back there, but you just take one, come out of the bottom of this channel, going into the top of this channel, and then you can blend the two of them together.
So you're using both of those inputs
You have
simultaneously?
you have the ability to use both channels.
Very cool. Let's see what that sounds like.
Okay. So.
The sustain on that is killer.
Yeah, it'll go forever.
That's very cool. So there's all these different permutations and combinations that you can get with these inputs on this amp.
Yeah.
Tell me about the controls. What do we have here? We got a treble, we got a middle.
Yeah, it's a pretty basic EQ. You get your bass, middle, treble, pretty self-explanatory. Personal taste, I tend to run not necessarily this amp with the bass all the way off, because once you get it loud enough, there's so much bass response from the cabinet that this, any more than like right there, is going to get pretty flubby. Depends on the person, obviously. You got your 2 volumes for each channel. You got your high treble for this side, normal for this side, and then obviously your presence, which just kind of adds a bit of a high-end bite.
Yeah, tell me more about the presence knob. I think that's one of the more mystifying controls in amps, especially because they usually only show up on Marshalls or Marshall imitation amps.
Yeah.
What does the presence knob do?
So it has to do with the negative feedback circuit. I'm not going to explain it because that's still a bit of a mystery to me, to be completely honest. But essentially is you're just adding, to me what I'm hearing when I use it is it's just adding in a lot more like high-end bite and kind of crisp to the thing. I mean, you can run it with that all the way off. It's a little bit darker, but I mean, it's not like that night and day thing. But obviously, once you get up to a certain point, it's going to just start squealing uncontrollably, no matter how well built the amp's made. So
Right. That's cool. So you're kind of you have a lot of EQ opportunity here to control your sound.
Yeah.
That's cool. And again, all of the sound that we're hearing in the episode today is just straight into the amp, straight out of the amp.
Yep.
Matt, why don't you send us off with a nice big chord?
I've got a nice big A.